for us, the job matters. We Chinese have like a mystic belief, obsession about anything with jobs. Okay. Uh, why? Because the job stands for the collectivism. The job doesn't stand for just one individual. It stands for an institution, an establishment, a more trustworthy entity in many cases. So that's why I need a job on my personal letter of recommendation. And that's how I started my next phase of journey in Guangzhou. This is the school I'm working for. It's more multilingual and more multicultural setting. We have lots of people from other countries, and we have lots of departments focusing on different languages. I think we have a department devoted to the study of Indonesian languages, and we have other departments on Malay and Thai, I guess, and Burmese as well. During my stay at the Guangdong University of Foreign Studies, I mostly focused on translation of books and novels. This is I translated and published some Chinese novels, and then I translated some, Canadian books. This one for this is the Chinese version for think tanks in China. And then recently we have finished working on the translation of the Oxford Handbook on the science of science communication. Hopefully will be published maybe next year or by the end of this year. But I gained more insight on cross-cultural communication during from my experience working at this major trade fair. It's called Canton Fair. It's held every year, twice a year. We have like thousands of businessmen from China and overseas, from other countries, who come here, sell and buy things. The trade volume can reach sometimes to 100 billion to 20 billion dollars. So it's a very large fair. You can look at the size of the exhibition center. So we mostly during the busy seasons, like we all mostly have second and third year students working as interns there. The teachers, we as teachers would go there as well to assist the students to do their job. We're not there to do the job. We are there to help the students. You can see, you can look at the students working there as receptionists or translators or staff for the whole affair. It's quite intensive. They handle lots of clients. During those years of working there, so I observed that most of our students, if they want to work very successfully there, they need to have the following skills. First one, they need to be very tax savvy. I mean, young people nowadays, you know how to look for information, locate information, find information, and use information. So there's one good example that one day we had like two Russian businessmen who spoke little English, a bit. So they came to the fair. They wanted to buy something, an electric incense burner. All they had was a short YouTube video showing how this burner worked. They had no idea what the brand name. They had no idea who made it. They had no idea even if it was Chinese or not. So, however, the students helped them to find the seller on Amazon, both Amazon and Taobao, and they also tracked down the company which made this product. And very fortunately, they also they also got to know that the company was setting up a tiny store at this fair. So within an hour, they directed the two Russian businessmen to their um, Chinese manufacturer of this product. So you can see how efficient if the translator or interpreter uh, are tech savvy. The other thing that comes into our notice is that we work in a multilingual and multicultural setting. That means, in most cases, if we talk about cross-cultural communication, it's more often like a binary mode. It's like Chinese versus English, or Indonesian versus English, or Indonesian versus Chinese. Okay, but then in those settings, we come to know that communication happens in a very much more complex setting. So the example I'm going to share with you is about the usage of a Chinese term. So in Chinese, these two terms, okay, they are the same. They all mean that, okay? The first one is used in informal occasions and pronounced as 那个. The second one is used on colloquial, on less formal, more informal occasions. It's pronounced as 那个. So we came to be aware that even if we are speaking to one another in colloquial Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and the usage of the second term can be subject to misinterpretation by people of African origins because it sounds like the N word. Okay, so that means even if we don't intend to offend them, we could potentially cause misunderstanding, and that means we need to, regulate on the usage of our own languages in those settings. And this is just one example. I mean, detection of those difficulty snags, as I call it, because we're often not aware of that, not aware of these problems. Detection of these snags can be difficult, but tackling those problems can be even more difficult in today's world. We got social media, we got Twitter, Facebook, WeChat, Weibo. Any tiny problems can be overblown in 1 or 2 seconds. I'm going to give you one example. Okay, you can watch this short clip. Okay, you can look to the left and see the lines there. This is the source text, the original film dialogue. So one says, "What? Look at my knees. What kind of knees are these?" The Chinese guy said, "Chinese." Okay, and then the subtitle is translated as that. Okay, what? See what's beneath my knees. You know what lies beneath my knees? Gold. You can see there has been quite a change. Okay, quite a change in the translation of the original filmic dialogue. Unfortunately, in subtitling, the presence of the source text, the original dialogue, is still there. Okay, and you might be wondering that why did the translator make those changes? Oh, because the conversation conversation was derived from a pretty racist city. It's like Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese. Look at these. Um, it's regarded as racist. That's why the translator, cleansed or signified the line into a Chinese proverb. There's gold under a man's knees. Okay, So the translator,
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
definitely was aware of this problem. Okay, he took measures to
Kok sampai
he
pas
tried
banget
to
mobil tak ganggu.
hmm? Any question? He tried to 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 make it look better, but he failed. The film was screened, and then the next day, the issue blew into a gigantic PR failure. And the next day, the film was pulled from all cinemas in China. Uh, Researchers have been talking about subtitling or dubbing as means of, ideological manipulation. But in this case, the translator clearly failed in that manipulation. So it's a very very costly lesson because the film cost about $60 million. Tencent, a Chinese company, invested $35 million. Okay, so the film was like scuttled right, even like right in its maiden trip, like a Titanic. It's a Titanic failure, and then that brings this issue to us, like translators. We don't just translate things, or we don't just work as a scribes. You know, so we need to have that awareness and the competence to manage cross-cultural communication. And in our case, the translator clearly underestimated his audience, his or her audience. He or she underestimated the significance of social media. Okay, social media can make or break a film in like a few seconds. And definitely, there's nothing. The translator also kind of like misread the social political climate at that time. China uh, versus America in this trade war, ongoing trade war. So the tension is already very tense, and such mistakes cannot be easily overlooked by his Chinese audience. Okay, so this is clearly um, a failure, translation failure, and a very expensive one. So therefore, it illustrates that the importance of not just linguistic competence, but also the cross-cultural communication skill on the part of the translator. It's a very expensive lesson. I'm not sure if you guys play mobile phone games, but I saw a few students do. So I would like to share with you the opportunity, challenges, and opportunities. Okay. So everyone has been talking about artificial intelligence, machine translation. Google Translate can do a very good job. A lot of translation softwares developed by Chinese companies can achieve accuracy rates from 70 to 80% in certain genres. That's very impressive. Okay, that saves a lot of work for translators. That also means that translators, you know, our jobs might be in danger. A few years ago, a Chinese company even experimented with like machine instantaneous translation, instantaneous interpretation, uh, machine translation on that sort. Okay, that's these are the future. I think we need to embrace the future. But the thing is, the challenges come, but also it also opens up like new opportunities. For example, localization, because localization, like the localization of video games, they requires people who know both multiple languages, who have this kind of cross-cultural communication skills, and who have developed this multicultural sensitivities in this modern world. So these are very important as well. I'm going to share with you a few examples here. So our school is located in Guangzhou. very fortunately, we're close to a number of major IT players in China. So I don't know if you have heard about this. The first one is NetEase Games, and then we have an uh, AI company, iFlyTech, and then Tencent. So during the past few years, these companies have been recruiting interns from our school, and invariably they all ask, they all demand the interns to have very strong cross-cultural communication skills. So these companies are all aware of this importance. And it's the same case for some other students who work at international organizations. Um, these students are from a different school. They're from the School of Interpretation and Translation Studies. We have a number of these students working as in-house interpreters for international organizations, or they just work as a staff member of these organizations, and they all mentioned that to succeed in those settings, we need to have these strong cross-cultural communication skills. So, but these skills are not cannot be taught. We don't have any classes. We couldn't have developed a course for that. These skills are acquired on the basis of a very strong linguistic competence. We know multiple languages. We interact with multiple cultures, and then we gradually cultivate that awareness of multicultures, and then we develop that competence to succeed in this increasingly complex digital globalized world. I think that's all. Thank you very much. Yeah, I have finished. Thanks. Thank you.
Well, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Tao Song, for the uh, precious informations and also knowledge. Yeah, thanks for the sharing. Well, okay. Now it is time to come to the last presenter, Mr. Christopher Woodridge. Yeah, he is an independent researcher and translator with an interest in Indonesian cinema. Yeah, Indonesian literature and the intersection between them. Yeah, his publications, yeah, include literary works such as Jati Sabha, yeah, kindling from the Green Tree, translated from the uh, novel by Ramaida Akmal, 2015, yeah, and Nonsense of Allegory of Roaring Space, translated from the poetry collection by Sitok Srungenge, 2015, as well as academic work such as general morphology, yeah, an Indonesian language perspective, translated from the book by Praptomo One, yeah, Baryadi, 2011. Yeah, article he has translated have been published in dozens of journals, yeah, around the world. Let's now welcome Mr. Christopher to present the material. Please, Mr. Christopher Woodridge, time is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. Um, I would just like to build on what everyone has been discussing. So where the first presenter gave us a bit of a perspective on her experiences as an interpreter in Indonesia, and our second speaker gave a bit of a feedback about translating English into his native language, I would like to take the opposite approach and take my discussion and focus on the translation of an Asian language into English. I'm going to apologize ahead of time if I yawn during my presentation. We are approaching midnight here in Canada. It's a bit late, but I am very excited to get through and share a little bit of what I've done as a translator. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can. We can see it.
All right. Okay, thank you. So, as mentioned already, I have translated a fair few academic and literary texts into English from Indonesian. I am going to focus on one specific example, namely Ramaida Akmal's Jatisaba, which I translated as Jatisaba, kindling from the green tree. So just for a bit of background, Jatisaba was a book published by Ramaida Akmal, which won the DKI Jakarta Arts Council Novel Award in 2011, if I remember correctly. And it was among the books selected for Indonesia when it was the country the country featured at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2015. Now, this novel was approximately 200 pages, but Umi mentioned earlier about the crunch time, 1 day, 5 days. It was 200 pages in 5 weeks. It was not conducive to the best translation practices, going in and back translating back and back. There wasn't enough time, especially since in the end, we still had to go through all the publication processes within a month before shipping everything off to Germany. So on the left, you can see the cover of the original novel, which was published in Indonesian. And on the right is a copy of the novel as it was presented in Frankfurt. The published version has a red cover, but unfortunately I don't have a scan of the cover here with me. Now, just to give you a bit of a summary, Jatisaba deals with a young woman who returns home to rural Cilacap to deal with what is essentially a human trafficking operation. But she's not law enforcement. She is working for the traffickers, and she is trying to use her networks with the people of her hometown to try and get people to work as illicit migrant labor in Malaysia and neighboring countries. So this being set in Cilacap, needless to say, there was a lot of very unique culture that is not the same as the perhaps more orthodox Javanese culture of Yogyakarta and Solo. So for myself as well, because I was living in Yogyakarta at the time, it was also much of a learning experience. I had to look into the traditional culture being dealt with, and also the type of Javanese used. It wasn't kromo, it wasn't ngoko, it was ngapa. And needless to say, in Yogyakarta, I did not have much access to people using bahasa ngapa, as well as popular culture references to national and international culture, religious references, and also some different linguistic elements. Now, These cultural elements, you can obviously have an overlap with the language. For example, Jatisaba, Jatisobo. The name itself, we can see follows Japanese language naming conventions. Jati, peak or essence, sobo, to travel. Now, for an Indonesian reader, perhaps the title Jatisobo, okay, I can imagine this is rural Java, it's a village, okay. For someone in the West with no idea of Indonesian naming customs, Japanese naming customs, it means nothing. And thus, Ramaida and myself decided to add a subtitle. And of the 3 subtitles we were considering, ultimately we decided to go with Kindling from the Green Tree. First of all, it was intended to capture readers' interest. How can green wood be used for kindling, which is usually the dry wood used for making a campfire, for example? It's also reflective of the plot in that the main character has to convince the villagers to leave the village to work abroad. And thus it illustrates the challenges that must be overcome. And there's also a reference to Islam, including a verse from the Surah Yasin, which in the English translation reads, "It is he who made for you from the green tree fire, and then from it you ignite." So we can see just in the, even before we open the book, even before we look into the content of the text, there were a few different considerations that had to be made when doing this particular translation. Now, to get into more specific and diverse cultural influences, in the 200 and somewhat pages of the novel, Jatisaba dealt with a wide range of, well, basically everything you would expect living in rural Java. There were indigenous names for foods, klepon, gembus, apem, esmambo, plants, kelor, lumbu, sangon, ketapang, animals, kating, dere, babon, curingan. And many of these do not have English language translations. Babon, for example, a hen which is of the age to bear or to lay fertile eggs. In English, that does not have a commonly used term. Perhaps in certain farming circles there is a term. However, most urban readers who would be looking into translated novels would likely be unfamiliar with it. And then we have also references to supernatural beings, kuntilana, sandekolo, the witching hour, references to the Japanese calendar, right? The different dates, Manis, Legi, Kliwon, Jumat Kliwon. I think there is that somewhere in there. And different kinds of dance, rongeng, abuk, jarang kepang, and so on, so on. And unlike a film where we could perhaps just leave it untranslated and present it on screen, ultimately, I was left with the decision whether to translate these roughly, as was done with Man Tiger. I forget the name of the author, but I remember reading the English language translation, and one of the Sundanese language foods was translated pancake. It was problematic because it was rural West Java in the 1960s. You weren't going to expect what a Westerner thinks of when they think of a pancake. So in the end, because the original novel used footnotes, 75 in fact, we decided to include footnotes in the English language edition. This is very uncommon in literary translations. If you read the works published by Yayasan Lontar, for example, they tend to avoid including footnotes in the running text. At most, they may have some footnotes in the introductory text, which provide a bit of context for foreign readers. And where possible, we also used some terms. Chinchao, grass jelly, satay has been localized here as satay with AY instead of E. You saw earlier with Maumi's presentation, tempeh, tempeh with an H. And even then that was problematic because it's not everybody understands these words. Here I have the example sangon, but even tempeh, my city here in Canada, despite a population of 200,000, only began selling tempeh maybe 10 years ago. So many people who are not of Southeast Asian descent remain unfamiliar with it. All right. Now, there were examples where it was feasible to have an explanation in the running text. I have a couple on screen because, well, needless to say, it's a lot easier for readers. They don't feel their eyes going up and down, up and down, up and down. And for the casual reader, well, that is very unappetizing. When I first attempted to read Senogumira Ajidharma's story about the contract killers, I forget the title, but it made references to Khairil Anwar's poetry. And because I was just learning Indonesian at the time, it was very distracting for me. If, as someone who was learning the language and learning the context, I was having difficulty. You can imagine how people reading a translation would feel. There were also several references to popular culture, Korean films, the Indian actor Salman Khan, Fabio Cannavaro, I believe, a motorcycle racer, ninjas, etc. And even a reference to a domestic actor, Adam Suseno, more specifically to his mustache. Most of the international references could be clarified. However, because understanding the line about Adam Suseno's mustache relied on having an image of who it was, this was unfeasible. And so I chose to use a reference to someone with a very prominent handlebar mustache as well, Burt Reynolds. I have had some people question why, and simply because if your translation is making the reader Google something, it's probably going to be problematic. You can imagine if you're translating or interpreting in a courtroom context and you have to pull out your phone and say, okay, let me look up this word really quickly. It doesn't work. Now, for religion, although the characters themselves were not depicted as devoutly religious, needless to say, as a novel taking as its context rural Java, Islamic practices and culture were very strong in the narrative. There were 2 references to the Quran, including scripture cited directly. There was reference to the women gathering for Yasinan, as well as Arabic language interjections such as mashallah and astaghfirullah, which in English parlance are not common. And indeed, most foreign readers, at least in the West, would not be familiar enough with Islam to be able to immediately recognize these references. In an office setting, one of my coworkers was asking our boss, who happens to be Muslim, to explain Ramadan to him because it had come up in the conversation. And despite Ramadan being a very prominent part of Islamic belief and culture, he had no familiarity with it. If that something that general can be a little understood, one can imagine the idea of Yasinan and how poorly it would be understood by the average reader. So for this, again, footnotes were used in this text, but limited in length because going into too much detail would be detrimental to readers' ability to enjoy the text. Now, an interesting part of this text or translation project was the language itself. When we speak Indonesian, when we speak Javanese, code mixing is common. And even if we're saying the rudest things, we tend to use relatively polite language. In Indonesian, very few people are going to use swear words, for example. Many of the Indonesian friends I made preferred using English language swear words. And so in this context, we had a woman who was dealing in human trafficking, who was working with essentially a gangster and using relatively polite language in the tropes of Western detective fiction and whatnot. It is relatively uncommon to see such refined language usage. And ultimately, we decided to use a vernacular American English for the translation as opposed to British English, because as a Canadian, I am not entirely fluent in British English, and Australian and Canadian English are relatively little spoken, and thus they were relatively untracked as well. The language, as I mentioned, became a little bit coarser. I have a couple examples on screen. For the sake of our recording, I will not speak them out loud. And in some cases, there were idioms which required a more idiomatic approach for translation. So I have the examples online. A literal translation would feel inappropriate. In English, for example, we do not say someone is itchy if they are aroused by somebody, and thus a more appropriate translation was necessary. Now, for code switching and code mixing, as I mentioned earlier, for example, earlier our opening speech was delivered in Arabic, English, and Indonesian. Many times in English speech, code mixing is not common. In this case, I maintained the code mixing with Javanese, which was strange, I will admit. It was awkward, especially for foreign readers. In the future, I think I would consider, if I had more time, going into something such as Scots or Gaelic, which has similarities with English, but which is also different enough and distinct enough that the code mixing would be tangible for the average reader. Okay. Now I'm going to finish up early. So just from these examples, I want to highlight a few things for our participants who are interested in textual translation. First of all, cultural context is important. Something that is very common, even ubiquitous in one culture, may not be common in another culture. Something such as, for example, giving a gift with your left hand. In an Indonesian text, someone might say, "Oh, maaf, tangan kiri." In English, nobody's going to say, "Sorry, I have to give it to you with my left hand." It's left hand, right hand, same thing. And there are situations such as this that will arise where you will need to be careful and knowledgeable of what needs to be conveyed and what is intended as well. So ultimately, you are striking a balance between readability and fidelity. The extent to which this balance is strict is going to depend heavily on the purpose of your translation. If you're translating an academic text, one must be very careful about citing with fidelity, whereas in a literary text, there tends to be a lot more leeway, localization as well. And I believe that is all I am going to summarize here. I will note, however, and just to add to Ms. Umi's note, another fun thing about translation payments, it may be very late, and if the client does not like the quality of your translation, they may decide they don't want to pay you at all, even though you've already worked 2, 3, 4 days. So that is definitely something to be cautious about in the future. Okay, thank you.
Well, okay. Thanks to all the presenters, yeah, Bu Umi, Mr. Tao Song, Mr. Christopher Woodridge, yeah. We all have got a lot of knowledge of translations from you all. Yeah, now it is time to have discussions. Yeah, I will let the audiences or participants to ask questions. Yeah, about the topic of seminar today. Because time allocation is only 30 minutes, or maybe we can make it more, I think, because we still have more time. So we will divide this to be 2 sessions. Yeah, the first session will be 3 questions, and we will wait and let see next, if we still have time, we will add more sessions. Yeah, in this question you can ask a question to Bu Umi, Mr. Tausong, or Mr. Christopher Woodridge. So please use these good occasions, yeah, to question all great presenters. And before asking question, you should mention your name, yeah. And doing this, you can raise your hand, and I will point you from here. Yeah. Okay. I please you. Okay, please. You can raise your hand and deliver your questions. You can ask to Bu Umi, Mr. Tausong, or Mr. Christopher. You can make your video on and raise your hand and deliver and mention your name. Yeah. Or you can also write down in the chat box if you want to give question from the chat box.
Mr. Kurniawan, perhaps if it will stimulate discussion, I could ask a couple questions to Bu Umi and Mr. Taosong.
Yeah. Sure. Welcome.
Okay. First question for Ms. Umi. In your experience with interpretation, have you had any difficulty?
Okay, I please you if you have question to Miss Umi.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear you earlier. Your audio's been breaking up. My first question for Ms. Umi. In your experiences with interpretation, have you had difficulty with the different terms which have very specific meaning in specifics? For example, I know to use the reference to the divorce case previously, in some legal systems, separation is not only berpisah, as in to be apart, but to live apart, to not have any intention of remaining married, and therefore part of a divorce proceedings. If in cases where, and second, in cases where there are these specific meanings, specific contextual meanings, how do you address them? How do you address the disparities in the two languages you are interpreting? And for Mr. Tausung, I was curious, you mentioned that you've been dealing at times with foreigners who go to,
or do you want to elaborate more?
Okay, you can answer it directly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris, for the questions. It's very interesting question. I have to recall this from my previous experience. Luckily, at that time, it was only once. So, and it's not quite long in the courtroom. And there's no specific terminology, if I can say, come up at that time. But then only one I can remember during the mediations, it's harta gono gini, something like that. And it is true. I don't really get this in English terminology. So I just say like the money you have together. So you have to separate the money and the assets you both previously had. So yeah, it's true that I really think that my preparation at the time was not really enough, even though it was only like 2 hours. And that 2 hours is not really the time we spend in a courtroom. It's included the time when we waited for the juries to come in. But then I was lucky at the time, as I told you, that that's not really long time I have at the time. So in terms of the terminology there, I still work very hard to, catch the perfect or the best word in English. But somehow I was also helped by the book, if I'm mistaken at the time. It's like a printed one, the versions of the discussion, the mediation. So yeah, I just show the clients that this one she was talking about. Yeah, that's my experience. Not really helpful actually, but thank you for addressing the questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Woodridge, for the question here. From my experience, I think Mandarin Chinese, the use of Mandarin Chinese is not widespread among non-Chinese people. The intonation, of course, as you mentioned, is very difficult to master. The writing system can be very baffling confusing in many cases. So both are pretty big hindrance to non-Chinese learners of Mandarin Chinese. Therefore, in my experience, according to my experience, that English is mostly used on many occasions, along with languages like Spanish. We have a large Spanish-speaking client group coming to the trade fair every year, and then we have some Arabic speakers as well. But as I said before, it's like French as well as. But as I said before, I think in most like 80 to 90% of the cases, English is used for the transactions, and then we have speakers of English from all over the world, which basically means that 80% of the people coming to the trade fair are not native speakers of English. And therefore, you can see that when two non-native speakers are trying to communicate with one another in a third language, and then they bring with this into this conversation with their own linguistic and cultural peculiarities, and then that means we bound to have lots of cases of miscommunication or failure. That definitely requires the Chinese staff working in those settings to have a very strong sense of the possible cultural miscommunicative pitfalls, and that's a must for us. Thank you.
Okay, and then for participants, yeah, now I ask you please question. Do you have your open questions for all participants? Okay, I will. Oh yeah. Ya, oke. Sudah belum saya. Saya udah on. Okay, there is a question from chat. Ya, it is for Bu Umi. Ya, it is question in bahasa Indonesia. Saya izin bertanya kepada Miss Umi, seperti yang dijelaskan tadi, ya. Miss Umi dibayar menggunakan kaos, makanan, dan lain sebagainya. Saat itu Miss Umi menerimanya atau tidak? Lalu bagaimana cara mengatasi semuanya agar tidak kembali dibayar dengan barang ataupun makanan? Ya, maybe it is asking about maybe Bu Umi, you have a suggestion how to make people give more appreciations to translator.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Kurniawan, and thank you, Azari, for the questions. What made me wonder is that you have Chris and Tao, who are very expert in many, interesting and wonderful idea about translation. But then you ask me this kind of questions. Oh my God, it seems like it shows my level. It's just. Anyway, how will I just answer this? Yeah, it's true that previously I was paid by like thanks and then foods and then clothes. Yeah, somehow I accept it. What else I can do? I just take it. But sometimes if I didn't want to the food, I didn't want to wear the clothes, I just give it to somebody else. That's the end. What can I do to make me get more valued? Is that, yeah, of course, as a translator, we have to improve our experience, improve our capabilities. Like I mentioned before, you can join like these workshops or joins like translation bureau, so that if you join certain translation bureau, I believe they have like this training, or you can join in Indonesian context, Himpunan Penerjemah Indonesia, or you can join from Universitas Indonesia. It's like workshop also or training for the translators, and they help you a lot. If you already got, or if you have already joined such kind of translation bureau, they will pay you in a, a more appropriate amount of money. So there's no other way. If you want to get well paid, you have to improve your, competence in a translator things. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Bumi, yeah, for the answer, yeah, for the sharing the experience. Okay. The other questions. Okay, this is a question from Gusti Faradila. Yeah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Gusti Faradila. I would like to ask all speakers. Yeah. My first question is why you choose to be translator. Second, when we translating some work, the differences of tradition and culture must have been very influential. What do you suggest we do about it? Thank you. Hello, Bumi. Do you listen to me? Can you listen to me?
Kayaknya jalur idik. Tidak akeh barang.
The questions, yeah. Why do you choose to be translator? Yeah, it is the reason why you choose to be translator, being translator. And the second, yeah, when translating some work, the differences of tradition and culture must have been very influential. What do you suggest we do about it? It is from Gusti Faradila.
I think Chris or Tao will answer that question first.
Mr. Christopher.
All right, thank you. For the first question, I was studying Indonesian literature, first at Universitas Sanata Dharma and then at Universitas Gadjah Mada. And because I am a native speaker of English, many people began coming to me to ask me to translate their works. Sometimes abstract, sometimes just chapters or sections in their articles, but over time, word of mouth spread, and I found myself becoming a translator. And now it's become my main source of income. I never formally learned how to become a translator. I never received any formal instruction, even outside of my programs, because, well, in the Indonesian literature program, they don't teach translation. You're lucky if you get BIPA. But that was it basically for me. And for the second question, I don't think you can have a universal answer. It's going to depend on the context, what you're trying to translate, for whom you're translating, and what the purpose of your translation is. For something very simple, we have in English, if you teach a man to fish, or sorry, if you give the man a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. A lot of Indonesians translate it simply as lebih baik memberi kail daripada ikan. In many cases, that's okay. You don't translate it literally. The main purpose behind the utterance is there. But if you look at the two different sentences, teaching a person to fish, emphasis on knowledge, kail, fishing pole, emphasis on the tool. And that, if you are trying to illustrate a cultural difference, cannot really be bridged, because one emphasizes knowledge, something within the being, the other emphasizes something outside the being. So a universal approach would not be appropriate in that context, for example. Okay, thank you, Mr. Towson.
Yeah, the first question of becoming a translator. Well, I don't know, it just happened, I guess. I mean, like 90% of my college classmates, they all dropped out of the trade, and they're now working in other fields, pretty successful as well. So I think I just followed the working as a translator in a major company, and then working for some international organizations, and then I got a job at just like you guys do, at a pretty good college whose specialty is language studies. So that's how I kind of like flowed, kind of like follow. I did like particularly try to do that. Just like I think it just happened in my case. Because working as translator or working as translator and interpreter in China is can be very competitive and very intense. So I think most of the people who go to our colleges end up having working in other capacities, but they have the translation. They have the skills to strengthen their to compensate for their competitiveness. And the second question about the differences of tradition and culture. I think that's it's very. I think that this is a very difficult question. It requires different strategies. When we're translating a book from Chinese into English, and it's paper-based, the medium is different. Therefore, we have more space. Therefore, we can try to add footnotes or add some more explanations about some cultural specific items in the text, to let the readers know. But if we're dealing with other mediums like audiovisual translation or game localization, the medium requires us to adopt different strategies. In those cases, we would be like we would be looking for some sort of equivalent of the original term of phrasing, so that it can also these terms must kind of read and sound Chinese, but can be very easily accessible for non-Chinese speakers. And these issues can be very complicated depending on the medium we work with. Thank you.
Sorry, me? Sorry, Pak Kurniawan, is that the question for me also, or?
Yes, it is for all speakers.
Okay. I think I will underline that every single thing mentioned by Chris and also Sir Tao Song is correct. It's quite hard when we're talking about whether we have this kind of one only general strategy or something to deal with any kind of text. We cannot simply do that because Mr. Christopher also mentioned before that whenever we want to translate, we have to consider about who is the target reader, what text we are going to produce. And then basically this is called the scopus. And this is the thing that we cannot generalize every single translation with only using one type of strategies or technique. So yeah, it's a little bit tricky of a So
Okay, thank you, Bu Uni. Yeah. The next is the question from Desi Rahmawati. Yeah. Desi Rahmawati want to ask to Mr. Chris. Yeah. Yeah, it is the question from her. Based on your explanation, there are so many things to cover to get good translation. It will surely them all. What is the most effective way to achieve them based on your experience? This for Mr. Chris.
Okay, thank you, Pak Kurniawan. Desi, you are correct. It will take a extensive time to prepare for translation. Probably the most important thing is to continue reading, because the translator, like any writer, must begin as reader. It gets you exposed to new different things, different paradigms that will help you understand what you are trying to translate. If you have the opportunity to live in a country where the language and culture are used, that is good as well. I am certain Miss Umi, when she returns to Sulu, will have a much better time with her translation, having had a first-hand experience in Australia with how native speakers in that country speak and how they think. So that is it for me. Thank you.
Well, okay. Okay, then next question is from El Piono. Yeah, question from El Piono. It is to all speakers or to all presenters. Yeah. The question is before translating or interpreting, do you decide or aware your political positions? How context of translations production and reception shape your position?
for me,
Yes.
yeah, okay, I'll start. Thank you for the question, Elpiono. It's very interesting questions, and I think we already highlight that one before. But then it is true that before we decide on doing certain project on translation, we have to again be aware of to whom this translation is for, and then what the type. I mean, what are the target texts? Is there any cultural differences we have to deal with? Can we simply translate this into that, and many other things? But the most important thing here is that we want to translate something, we have to consider about scopus, the purpose of the translation itself. And luckily, that's the thing I learned here. I mean, I study about that in Japanese to English translation. Thank you.
Well, okay, I please Mr. Chris and Mr. Chris.
Okay. I'm afraid that question is a lot more philosophical than I dare answer at this time of night, but I know ideally in translation and interpretation, we are supposed to conceive of ourselves as neutral third parties, as basically vehicles through which language is conveyed. Now, needless to say, this is an ideal type that cannot be realized in everyday linguistic practices, but in many cases, for example, in my situation here, I have been informed that one should not speak to the interpreter, one should speak to the client and have the interpreter translate. Now, needless to say, we still have, as translators and interpreters, we still have our own individual biases, which is something that I could consider, but in the present moment, I can't answer you in any further detail. I'm sorry.
Okay, Mr. Tao Song.
Okay. Thank you. The first question, I think I do agree with Mr. Woodridge. Translators should supposedly assume neutral position as mediators of intercultural, cross-cultural, interlingual communication. But sometimes it's really difficult to maintain that, especially if we work as interpreters. If like in a negotiation, two parties got into an argument, and then what we shall do? I mean, they are exchanging, they are exchanging angry words, and in those cases, I mean, working as conference interpreters, we can some cases we need to step in, but not in a not so obvious way to mediate somehow to mediate the different conflicts. For example, I can give you one example. If like two parties are being like worked up, their like the tension is really high, and then you can like, okay, let's have a coffee break, so they can like kind of like diffuse the tension a little bit, so they can calm down and come back and continue their discussion later on. So these are the zones we can somehow manage to play. But that being said, we work as interpreters and translators. Our capacity is very limited, to be sure, very limited. We work under a lot of strain, a lot of intense, stressful conditions, but we don't have the necessary freedom to do that. It's very difficult. The second question, the context of translation, production, and reception shape our position. Yeah, I think that's a very much true, like a Scopus theory. Christian Nord has been talking about how the end justifies the means. So we translate to serve a certain purpose. If we don't do that, the translation is a failure. I can give you a very good example. The translation of some Chinese classic novels published in the 17th century. So we have a very learned scholar who translated the novel, The Dream of Red Mansion, about like 20, 30 years ago. It's a classic, okay? It's published in China and in some other countries. But unfortunately, that translation has been like neglected by overseas non-Chinese readers. Most of the readers of that book, if ever they are interested in that book, they would read the Hawke's translation. It was translated in Hong Kong. More the phrasing tends to be more westernized. So that's the thing. So sometimes it's really hard decision for us. Do we want to preserve the unique features of Chineseness, or do we want to cater to our non-Chinese speaking readers or publishers? Thank you.
Well, okay. Thank you very much for Well, okay. Thank you very much for the answer and the explanation. Well, okay. It has been 30 minutes, yeah, for discussions, but we still have time, so I will let one more questions. Yeah. Uh, it is coming from Hidayatul Nurjana. Yeah, I will read the questions directly. It is for Mr. Woodridge. Yeah, the question is for Mr. Woodridge. I would like question. I would like to ask question to Mr. Woodridge. My name is Hidayatul Nurjana. First of all, let's thank yeah for your great presentation. It is very interesting to discuss since I'm Indonesian, but I did little research about Indonesian literature. My question is, did you find any problem in making word switching or translating Javanese Siang words such as trah, jeng, katrok, kampret, etc.? And how did you overcome this? And did you use any special dictionary to translate this? Since Javanese slang words are so many, yet sometimes, wait, since Japanese slang words are so many, yet sometimes they are difficult to be translated. Thank you. This is for
Okay.
Mr.
Yep. Thank you very much for the question. Fortunately, as someone who was living in Yogyakarta, I was exposed to quite a few different Japanese words, which were the same as they are in Cilacap. For example, tra is a very important concept in Jogja, especially given how many people are descended from the nobility in that city. For words which were less common in Jogja, or for words which were less common in the formal Javanese used in Central Java, I was able to consult with the author to understand how these words were used in rural Cilacap. So I was very fortunate. I was able to consult with the author. She happened to be my upperclassman at UGM as well. So we had known each other even before I received this translation opportunity, and it was able to be done. There are some cases. I know one of the people I communicated with a few years ago was looking into retranslating a novel for Lontar, and a few of the terms were West Sumatran ones that had different meanings in Indonesian, and thus he had to try and reach out to people in West Sumatra because the author for this work had died about 30 years previously and could not be reached. So there are many different resources that are available in situations such as this. Okay, thank you.
Seems like there is a trouble with the connection. Oh, okay. Mr. Kurniawan.
It's on, yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. I'll repeat. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. Alhamdulillah, all questions have been answered. Yeah. I'm sure our translations, translation and interpreting, yeah, especially classes between theories and practices has increased after joining this international seminar. Yeah, there are a lot of notes that we get from this seminar. Some of them are cultural context is important, yeah, for successful translations. Yeah, like Christopher said, yeah, readability for target audience must be balanced with fidelity. Better readability may means less fidelity, while more fidelity may mean less readability. Then best practices for contextual translation, I think, will differ depending on the source material, as will the depth of understanding expected of readers. But all translation will benefit from the awareness of the need to cross language and cross culture through translations. Yeah, and the last, we have to always expand our knowledge on and on. Yeah, we can join platform. Yeah, like Bu Umi suggestion. Yeah, platform for translator, interpreter, dubber, subtitler, and also pursue higher degree and expand our knowledge. Yeah. Well, okay, that's all our international seminar. Yeah, today may it be useful for us. Okay, assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I return this to Master of Ceremony, Bu Justin.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kurniawan and Hum. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of today's event. On behalf of the committee, I would like to send thankfulness and appreciation for the speakers as well as the participants. Hopefully, this seminar will give you enlightenment about translation and interpreting. Let's close this seminar by saying Hamdallah. I'm Justin Sartika is signing off. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you. Thank you.
Presentasinya linknya sudah dikirim ya di chat. Sebelum live mungkin bisa mengisi presentasinya dulu. Thank you. Thank you Bu Umi Pujianti. Thank you Tausong PhD candidate, and thank you Christopher Ellen Woodridge MA. Thank you all the participants. See you on the next seminar.
Thank you Pak Fajar.
Ya, sudah cukup ya. Sesi lanjutnya siang nanti.
Terima kasih Pak Fajar.
Ya, sama-sama. Live ya, kalau cukup ya.
Cukup Pak.
Oke, makasih. Assalamualaikum semuanya.
Ustadz.
Thank you teman-teman. Thank you. Sorry for any mistake.
Thank you Bu Umi fasilitasnya.
Sami Pak. Ini saya kalau keluar nggak apa-apa kan ya Pak? Nggak. Gimana toh?
Nggak apa-apa. Okay.
Oh iya, siap. Okay. Ini anak saya nangis di samping saya.
Oh, siap.
Okay. Duluan ya Pak.
The recording has stopped.
Assalamualaikum.
Kalau linknya sama besok berarti udah bisa tak share ke narasumber kita besok ya. Dadah teman-teman.
Ini makan siangnya. Jadi panas.